My first night as a security guard at the old Henderson Corp building, deep in rural New Jersey. After losing my previous job at a shipping company, I took whatever came my way. The pay was decent, and they needed someone urgently. They just wanted someone to cover the midnight shift in an abandoned building while the company decided whether to sell or renovate the place. It seemed easy enough. I thought it would be just me and a strong coffee fighting off sleep. The first time I set foot there, I already felt something strange. It wasn't fear yet, it was more like discomfort. As if the place wasn't exactly empty. The building had 8 floors, but only the first 2 had lighting. The others were shut down due to lack of maintenance. Cameras had been installed in strategic spots, but half of them were already offline. The routine was simple. Check the cameras, do rounds every 2 hours, and make sure no intruders got in. The building was in an isolated area with no neighbors nearby. At first, it seemed way too easy. I spent more time listening to podcasts and staring into space than actually working. But by the 3rd night, I started hearing noises. At first, I thought it was just the old structure settling in the cold night air. Creaks, cracks, stuff any old building would do. But then came the sound of footsteps. Not running or anything dramatic. Slow, dragging steps, like someone walking barefoot on dirty carpet. I checked the cameras. Nothing. I left the monitoring room, flashlight in hand. I went up to the 2nd floor, where the sound seemed louder. I didn't see anyone. But the doors, one of them was ajar. One I clearly remembered closing during my previous round. I went back to my post, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But the next night, the sound returned. And something else, a feeling of being watched. Not just the common feeling of being alone in the dark, but a fixed stare, almost physical, like someone was studying me from the shadows. I'm not the superstitious type, never was. But in that place, in that thick silence, something told me I wasn't alone there. The first time I heard about the 5th floor was from a janitor who worked there during the day. During a quick conversation, he said in a low voice that he avoided going up there. The lights don't work properly, and it always feels colder than it should, he murmured, looking away like he was recalling something he'd rather forget. I laughed to myself. Up until then, I thought everything was just an exaggeration. But that week, the 5th floor started calling attention on its own. It was just after 2 a.m. The camera system, already spotty, showed a faint glimmer coming from the emergency stairwell. A strange reflection. Like someone walking with a flashlight, except no beam moved. It just blinked in the same spot. I went up, flashlight in hand, more curious than scared. When I reached the 5th floor, a blast of cold air hit me. Dry cold. The kind that gets into your bones. It wasn't normal, considering the central heater still reached that far. I walked down a hallway covered in dusty carpet. My flashlight trembled in my hand. It felt like every step I took echoed more than it should. I was alone, right? But the silence seemed tense, almost like the building was holding its breath. I noticed one of the doors was open. It was an old conference room with glass walls. The chairs were all pushed to one corner. Strange. They should have been arranged around the table. And on the whiteboard, there were handprints, lots of them. Like someone had run their fingers through the dust, drawing chaotic lines. I left with my heart racing. Back at my post, I reviewed the cameras. That's when I saw it. For 2 seconds, in the corner of camera 5, the one I knew barely worked, a figure appeared in the hallway. Dark, still, seemed like it was staring straight at the lens. I watched the footage over and over. Fast forward, rewind, pause. The image vanished as quickly as it appeared. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't interference. It was there. And I had been just a few steps away. The next night, the elevator went up by itself. I was on the ground floor, and the panel lit up with the number 5. The elevator slowly rose, then came back down empty. That affected me more than I wanted to admit. I stopped going to the upper floors, kept as many lights on as I could, wore my radio glued to my ear. Still, the feeling returned. Like something or someone was waiting for me on the 5th floor, no matter the time. I don't know exactly when the fear stopped being just a nuisance and became part of my routine. That constant feeling of being watched had become as regular to my night shifts as coffee or patrols. But that week, something changed. Things started to go missing. First, it was my spare badge. Then, my radio disappeared from the monitoring room and reappeared inside a locked room on the 2nd floor. A key I didn't even use. How did it end up there? I had no idea. I tried to convince myself I'd been careless, but I knew that wasn't it. It was getting hard to keep lying to myself. One night in particular left a mark. I was watching the cameras, exhausted, eyes barely open, when the system sent out an alert. Motion detected on the 5th floor. On screen, a shadow slowly crossed the hallway. You couldn't see a face or even a clear body. It was dark. But not like a natural shadow. It had shape, intent. It seemed to pause in front of the camera, like it knew I was there, on the other side. I froze for a few seconds. The radio, which had been silent until then, began to hiss. And in the middle of the static, a sentence said in a slow, almost lifeless voice, "You came up here once. Why did you stop?" That chilled me to the bone. It was like something was calling me, not aggressively, worse, patiently. Like it knew that sooner or later I'd go back there on my own. The next night, during my rounds, I heard footsteps behind me on the 2nd floor. I spun around fast, flashlight in hand. Nothing. Not a soul. Just the sound of the elevator door opening on the floor above. I went to the stairs and looked up. The elevator was open, stuck on the 5th floor. Dark, empty. It started affecting me outside of work too. At home, I began waking up in the middle of the night in cold sweats, feeling like someone was at the foot of my bed. One night I dreamed I was trapped in that building, trying to escape through endless hallways. I woke up with my heart racing and a red mark on my arm, like someone had grabbed me hard. The next night, before I even started my shift, the radio began to hiss the moment I entered the security room. It was real. Something was there, waiting for me. It was a Friday. I remember because, deep down, I hoped it might be a quiet night. Weeks of tension had worn me down, and somehow, I wanted to believe it was all just in my head. Just another night. Just another shift. I arrived at the building around 11:40 p.m. Everything seemed normal, at least until I passed the reception and noticed something that had never been there before. A folded piece of paper on the floor, perfectly creased, with my name written by hand. The handwriting was shaky, like it was written by someone who didn't quite remember how to hold a pen. I opened it. Inside, only one sentence. "Come see me." That was the tipping point. I knew I couldn't run from it anymore. Something had been watching me. Something was calling me. And the truth was, as terrified as I was, I couldn't stand the weight of the waiting any longer. If it was going to happen, let it happen already. I grabbed the flashlight, the radio, and went up. I didn't take the elevator. I used the stairs, each step echoing like the whole building was listening. The silence was suffocating. When I reached the 5th floor, the stairwell door was slightly open. A strong smell of mold, or maybe rotting wood, filled my nose. The hallway was darker than usual. My flashlight shook in my hand, not from the weight, but from fear. I passed closed doors, windows covered in dust, and empty rooms, until I reached that old meeting room. The door was open. Inside, the table was set with chairs perfectly aligned. In the center of the table, a radio, just like mine, emitted a low, steady hiss. I stepped in, approached the device, and then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, dragging, coming from behind me. I turned immediately. The figure was there, at the end of the hallway, still unmoving. It had no face, but I could feel the eyes. Those invisible eyes that pierced my chest, my head, my soul. The flashlight flickered for a second, and in that brief moment, it moved. Closer, much closer. I began to back away without realizing it. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The radio fell from my hand. The hissing grew louder, became muffled screams, overlapping voices speaking in tongues I didn't understand. The light came back, and the figure was gone. But I felt it behind me, so close it seemed to breathe down my neck. I ran. I stumbled out of the room, raced down the floors, crashed into walls, dropped the flashlight, but I made it out. When I reached the ground floor, I looked back one last time. All the lights in the building were on. Even those on the 8th floor, which weren't even connected. I never went back. I quit the next morning. No notice, no explanation. Just sent a short email and blocked every number from the company. It wasn't about the job. It was about survival. For days I kept to myself. Slept little with the constant feeling that something had followed me home. That presence hadn't stayed in the building. It had taken root in my mind. Every shadow on the wall seemed to want to say something. Every noise in the middle of the night made me jump out of bed. I was on constant alert. I tried talking to someone about what I'd experienced, but the words sounded like madness. How do you explain that an abandoned building seemed to have a life of its own? That an entity, a faceless shadow, watched me every night? The few friends I still had just told me to rest. "You're just stressed," they said. But they didn't see what I saw. Over time, I realized the scariest thing wasn't what was inside that building. It was what stayed in me afterward. I started avoiding mirrors, always felt like I'd see something other than my reflection. I began sleeping with the lights on, and never, ever again could I stay alone in a silent place. Some nights, I still wake up to my phone radio hissing, even with no app open. Once, at 3:17 a.m., the phone lit up on its own and repeated that same distorted phrase, "Tonight, you come." I didn't go. I won't go back. But something inside me knows the building is still there, untouched, silent, waiting for the next lonely soul to take the midnight shift. Maybe someone curious, someone desperate for a paycheck, someone like me. And if one day you're offered a night watch job in an empty building, with few cameras, too much silence, and old stories forgotten in its hallways, decline it. Don't think twice, because not everyone who starts the midnight shift finishes it the same. Some just never finish it at all. I worked at Mile 46 station in the middle of a forgotten stretch of Route 89 in Arizona. It was one of those places you only find if you're truly lost, or if something brings you there. The nearest town was nearly a 40-minute drive away, and during the midnight shift, the desert became an absolute void. I took that job because I needed quick money and didn't have many options. It didn't seem hard. Stay at the convenience store, refuel cars, keep the register running. Most of the time, the station was completely empty. The nights dragged on, and I spent hours watching bugs slam into the fluorescent lights. The first few nights went smoothly. A few truckers stopped by, bought coffee, chatted a bit. The occasional lost tourist, always looking like they'd taken a wrong turn. But on the third night, something changed. It was 2:37 a.m. I remember clearly because I had just written it down in the logbook. An old black sedan pulled up to pump 4. Engine idling low, headlights on. But what caught my attention wasn't the car. It was the driver. He didn't get out. Just rolled the window down a few inches and stretched his arm out, holding 3 crumpled $20 bills. Not a word. No gesture beyond that calculated movement. I took the money, filled the tank, and when I turned to give the change back, the car was already gone, headlights off. Pulling out of the station. Silent. Far too fast. I thought it was just a weird guy, maybe paranoid, afraid of being robbed. But then it happened again, the next night, and again. Always at 2:37, always at pump 4, always the same 3 bills. And the car never had plates. I started paying closer attention. On the second record, I noticed the bills had the same serial number. It was the same money, as if it had never left the place. After that, other little things began to bother me. The lights on pump 4 flickered every time he showed up. The store radio lost signal for exactly 3 minutes. And the motion sensors never picked up his presence. I began writing everything down: temperature, moon phase, any detail that might explain it. But each new night only brought more questions. After a few weeks on the midnight shift, I realized the black car wasn't the only strange pattern around. Other customers started showing up, not often, but enough to keep me on edge. One night, just before 3 a.m., a man walked into the store. He was tall, very thin, in a spotless gray suit, totally out of place on that dusty highway. He walked slowly between the shelves without touching anything. What stood out was his sinister gaze. No irises, no whites in his eyes, just 2 empty voids. He didn't blink, not once. He came up to the counter, looked at me like he was analyzing. Then he simply left without saying a word. No purchase, no expression. I watched him pass through the glass door, and when I checked the security cameras, he wasn't there. In the footage, the store was empty. Just me behind the counter, no entry, no exit. That's when I started to seriously suspect something was wrong. I went to the locker room, where the old lockers from past employees were. On the inside of one locker door, nearly faded with time, was a note written in black marker. If the customer doesn't step on the ground when getting out of the car, close the store. I read it like 10 times. Just stood there, staring at the sentence, trying to figure out if it was a joke, a code, or a real warning. After that, I started paying attention to every detail about the customers, and then I saw it. An old 70s model car pulled up to pump 3, lights off, engine running. The door opened, but the man who stepped out didn't touch the ground. He floated, about 2 inches above the concrete. As if the ground didn't exist for him, I froze, barely breathed. Waited for him to enter the store, but he didn't. He just stood in front of the window, staring in, eyes fixed on me, for minutes. Then, unhurriedly, he returned to the car and disappeared. Literally, the car vanished before leaving the lot. That destroyed any logical explanation I'd been trying to hold on to. The camera file showed the car arriving, showed the pump working, but in 2 frames, it simply ceased to exist. From that point on, I stopped trying to understand, stopped trying to rationalize. I just followed the rules. And every time the clock neared 2:37, I knew it was time for pump 4, time to pretend nothing was strange, time to pretend the midnight shift still made sense. It was a Tuesday. Clear sky, no wind, and a silence so dense I could hear my own heartbeat. The kind of night that makes even the desert seem like it's holding its breath. That night, nothing happened until after 2. No cars, no bugs on the lights, no sound on the radio. Around 2:20, I noticed something strange. The fuel gauge on all the pumps dropped to 0. All the station lights went out at the same time. Total silence. I walked to the store's door and saw that the desert was darker than ever. Not even the moon was visible. Everything felt frozen in time. And then it arrived. An old, rusted car with headlights as dim as dying candles slowly pulled into the station. It stopped at pump 4, of course. But this time, there was no one in the driver's seat. The engine kept running, making an uneven, almost organic sound. A sort of metallic breathing. I waited, and nothing. I decided to get closer, left the store and walked to the car. The door was slightly ajar. When I looked inside, there were no seats, no steering wheel, nothing. Just a thick, impossible darkness that seemed to pull the flashlight beam inward. And then, in the rearview mirror, I saw something. For less than a second. A face, or what should have been a face. It had eyes, many of them, scattered across the surface, moving in different directions. And a mouth long, stretched from one side to the other. A smile that wasn't meant to be seen by human beings. The car door fully opened on its own, and with it came a sound. Not a scream, not a voice, a massive wailing, as if a crowd was crying inside that invisible car. Garbled, distorted noises that hurt the ears and the mind. I ran back to the store and locked all the doors, turned off everything I could, but something was off. Outside, the car was still there. But the store didn't seem to be in the same place. Through the window, the station no longer faced the highway. The desert had vanished. In its place, an endless gray plain, covered in mist, where distant little lights flickered, as if there were other stores, other stations, all disconnected from reality, as if I was trapped in a parallel version of that place. My radio hissed, now at a pitch so high it screamed inside my head. And no matter how hard I tried to breathe, the air felt absent. I was out of the world, out of time, trapped. Then, in a snap, everything returned. Lights, radio, and the highway. But the car was still there. The next morning, I handed in my badge and left without looking back. I didn't officially quit. Didn't pick up my paycheck. Gave no explanation. I just left. I spent weeks locked up at home. Didn't sleep well. Kept waking in the middle of the night to the sound of that engine still echoing in my ears. Sometimes I smelled gasoline in the air, even though I hadn't left the house. Other times I saw headlights outside, but there were no cars. I told no one what happened. Tried to forget. Tried to convince myself it was all just hallucination, exhaustion, paranoia. But then, the notes started. The first time, I found a folded piece of paper on my front doormat. No name, no recipient. Just a single sentence written in that same shaky handwriting I'd seen at the station. You saw too much. The following week, I found another. On my car's rearview mirror, you know where the road leads. And then, I started seeing the car. Not the same black sedan from Pump 4, but similar, always parked a block or two from my house. Never in the same spot, sometimes with headlights on. Other times, completely dark. I never approached it. Never again. One night, during a neighborhood blackout, I swear I heard its engine idling right outside my window. I stayed still for hours. When the sun came up, I checked the street. No car in sight. But there were fresh tire marks on the asphalt, heading away from the road. Since then, I don't stay alone at night. Don't drive after 10 p.m. and never, ever stop at roadside gas stations, especially the empty ones. Sometimes I think I shouldn't have taken that midnight shift, but other times, I think I didn't have a choice, like that place had been waiting for me, like it already knew my name before I ever arrived. And now, I just hope someone reads this account, that they understand, that they pay attention. Because if one day you find yourself on a deserted road, with the tank almost empty, and you see a gas station with a single light on, keep driving. Because some stations don't sell gas, they charge in other currencies. And not everyone behind the wheel is human. The factory sat on the outskirts of a small town in North Carolina. It was old, built in the late 1950s, specializing in industrial fabrics. Despite its abandoned appearance, part of the operation still ran during the day. But what really interested me was the night shift, the infamous third shift, where I'd be working alone, handling maintenance and security. I took the job because I needed the money, and honestly, the idea of being alone during the night, with no one around, actually sounded appealing. The building was massive, divided into dark warehouses, narrow hallways, and constantly smelled of burnt oil and old moisture. On my first day, They gave me a map with basic instructions and a key to almost every area, except the boiler room, which was locked off for safety reasons, according to the supervisor. The first few nights were uneventful. I did my rounds, filled out forms, made minor adjustments to machines, and spent the rest of the time in the break room reading or listening to the radio. But by the fourth night, something changed. It was around 2:40 a.m. when I heard the first strange sound, a loud metallic bang like a gear had fallen. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the sewing sector. Everything was dark. The machines were off, just as I'd left them. But the sound came again, this time closer. I followed it to a storage room for fabric rolls. Inside, everything looked untouched, but when I turned to leave, I clearly heard a voice. Faint, muffled, like a whisper coming from inside the walls. I spun around with the flashlight. Nothing. On my way back to the break room, I passed a mirrored window. In the reflection, I swear I saw someone walking behind me, but when I looked directly, the hallway was empty. The next night, the sound came back, but now more frequently. Soft knocks, metal creaks, and a sort of repetitive clicking, like a machine trying to start by itself. I knew there was no power in that sector at that hour. The emergency lights flickered, and the control panel showed all lines inactive. Even so, the sound of needles and looms filled the air, as if the factory, somehow, hadn't stopped. The feeling of being followed became constant. During rounds, I always heard footsteps behind me, but every time I turned, just the echo of my own breath. The following night, I received an alert on the internal radio, movement on line 3, but I was the only one there. When the panel showed movement on line 3, my first impulse was to ignore it. Part of me wanted to believe it was just a glitch, common in a place that old. But I knew it wasn't that. The sounds from the previous night, the reflections, the muffled voice. Something didn't add up. I grabbed my flashlight, adjusted the tool I used to reset the sensors, and went to the sector. The path to line 3 passed through hallways that always seemed darker than the rest of the building, even with the emergency lights on. As I turned the last corner, I could already hear the machines, the looms, working on their own, with no power. I approached slowly. The movement was perfect, too mechanical, too rhythmic. The needles went up and down like an invisible person was manually operating everything. The fabric coming out of the machines wasn't what we produced there. It was thick, dark, nearly black, with a strong smell of rust and something rotting. I touched the control panel. It was off. No lights, no sign of power. Disconnected from the source. That night, I shut everything down from the main breaker and filed a fake report. Wrote compressed air leak causing noises and returned to the break room. But I couldn't sit, couldn't relax. I knew something was out of control. The next night, I returned to line 3, this time before the usual events started. Everything looked normal, machines off, absolute silence. But when I checked the control panel, it showed partial production logged the night before. And stranger still, the number of units produced was exactly 237, the same number as on my employee file. I started keeping a notebook, logged everything, sounds, times, locations, triggered sensors. It all happened within a very specific window, between 2:33 and 2:57 a.m., not a minute earlier, not a second later. At the end of the line 3 hallway, there's a glass wall overlooking warehouse B2, deactivated for years. One night, looking through it, I saw a figure. It was standing, leaning against the wall, motionless. Tall, thin, with a body covered in something that looked like thick fabric, the same kind the machines had produced. When I shone my flashlight, the figure vanished, as if it had never been there. I went to the warehouse. It was locked with chains and a fire department seal. That figure couldn't have gotten in. And that night, when I went to shut down the sensors, I found a strand of black fabric stuck to the lever, exactly like what I saw on the line. From the moment I saw that figure in warehouse B2, something inside me changed. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was urgency, a suffocating feeling that this wasn't going to stop, that the factory was trying to show me something, or warn me. It was one of the following nights when I decided to dig through the old admin records. A locked room beside the supervisor's office, rarely used, filled with dusty folders, boxes of typed documents, and faded photos. No one had touched that place in years. My goal was simple: find records of malfunctions, accidents, or any mention of Sector B2. But what I found was much stranger. A box marked "Internal" caught my attention. Inside it were employee files marked in red. Missing. Yes, missing. Not terminated. Not transferred. Missing. There were at least 7 files, dated between the 1970s and early 2000s. All men, all night shift workers. And all shared a handwritten note. Last seen near line 3, Sector B2. The reports were chilling. Vanished among the looms. Last heard in the storage corridor. Presence detected on camera after clock out. But what disturbed me most was one specific file, dated 1998. The name was Paul Hewitt, 34 years old, night shift. Last note, seen heading to the boiler room. When I looked at his photo, it was the same face I had seen reflected in the break room window 2 nights earlier. In uniform, with the same blank expression, eyes fixed, like he was seeing something no one else could. From then on, sleep became a challenge. Every time I closed my eyes, I dreamed of the factory running by itself. The sound of machines echoing in the dark, shadows walking between hallways. And in every dream, I was followed by someone whose face was covered in dark fabric. I went back to the archive the next day and kept digging. I found a sort of unofficial manual, handwritten by a former employee. Loose pages filled with phrases like, "If the line runs by itself, don't touch the fabric. Never enter B2 after 2:33 a.m. What the factory produces at night isn't for delivery. They wear what we make." I returned to the break room in silence. But before leaving, I took one last look at the line 3 security camera. The image was frozen. And in the center of the screen, the figure covered in fabric stood before the machine, staring straight into the lens. For weeks, the boiler room was just a blind spot on my maps and patrols. Locked, forgotten, with a rusty sign warning, "Danger. No entry." But after everything I'd seen and read, that door started pulling at me like a silent magnet. The night I decided to go there, something was off from the start. The hallway lights flickered as I entered the factory. The air was heavier, as if the building knew I was about to cross a line. When I got to the boiler room door, I realized what made me stop. The lock was on the floor, broken. No sign of force, just open. Like it had come off by itself, I pushed the door slowly. The air inside was dense, damp, reeking of rust and something rotten, very rotten. The flashlight flickered, as if something interfered with the battery. The room was massive, full of concrete hallways, rusted stairs, old pipes, and walls stained with soot. But what caught my attention immediately were the objects scattered on the floor, workers' clothing. Some new, others clearly old, faded with time. There were also broken helmets, boots with deep drag marks, and rusty tools that looked like they'd been dropped mid-use. I followed a sound, low, constant, like a machine running slowly, with a deep, irregular hum, as if it were breathing. At the far end, I found a room with frosted glass windows. Something moved inside. The weak beam of my flashlight barely cut through, but I saw a huge shadow, taller than any person, with arms far too long. And the body seemed covered in layers and layers of dark fabric, like it was wearing everything the factory had ever produced. I tried to leave, but the lights failed completely. Total darkness. And then the sounds began. Footsteps, many, all around. Not human. They had a dry, uneven weight. Like whatever walked there had feet, but wasn't made to walk. I started running, guided only by the flashlight's flickering light. The place's layout seemed to shift. Hallways that once led directly to the exit now led to endless dead ends. At every turn, I felt further from the surface. Around one corner, I passed a glass wall. On the other side for a moment, I saw Paul Hewitt, the same face from the file. He was there, standing, watching me, and then vanished, without moving, as if swallowed by the darkness itself. I made it out, by some miracle, lungs burning, body covered in dust. But when I looked back, the boiler room door was locked again. After that night, my decision was simple. I had to get out. The factory wasn't just an old building with electrical problems. It was something alive. Something that breathed through the walls, that watched every step. Something that devoured those who dared to look too closely. I prepared everything for that to be my last night. I showed up in a clean uniform, ready to hand over my keys as soon as the sun rose. But from the beginning of the shift, I knew the factory wouldn't let me go so easily. The first strange thing was the system clock. Stuck at 2:33 a.m., all the machines appeared to be off. But the sound of looms filled the air like a sick, repetitive symphony. I passed by line 3 and saw all the needles moving, even with the panel turned off. The fabric coming out now was different. It looked like skin, human, pale, stained. The factory lights flickered in patterns, like a code. With every flash, shadows passed along the walls, cast by nothing visible. I started walking faster, trying to ignore the whispers now coming from all directions. Whispers saying my name. In the central corridor, every door was open, swaying slightly as if inviting me inside. The floor vibrated. The factory wasn't operating, it was alive. I ran toward the emergency exit, where there was a single metal door that led directly to the back of the warehouse. The doorknob was cold, nearly freezing. When I touched it, all the machines stopped. An absolute silence fell over the place. And then, I heard footsteps behind me. The doorknob turned with difficulty, as if the metal resisted. And when the door finally opened, I was hit by a gust of warm air outside. The sky was beginning to brighten. Dawn, the factory, seemed to retreat from the light. I managed to get out, but I never went back. I erased my number from the records, moved to a new city, changed my name on some networks. I did everything I could to disappear. But nothing could erase the memory of that place. Today, years later, I still sometimes wake in the middle of the night to a faint sound from the kitchen. A ticking, like a machine weaving. Other times, I feel a cold breeze on the back of my neck, as if a door is opening behind me. And the strangest part? My clothes, all of them, without exception, have tags sewn with the same number, 237. And even far from the factory, I know it still wants me back.